the green light. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I should say almost thank you again for asking us to host a EU-Australia meeting. It's becoming now almost a tradition. About 2 years ago, some of you may remember, we have hosted the climate change minister, and we had a very interesting discussion. It was a very different world. We talked a lot about climate change, energy, hydrogen, and these issues. Today we have a very different topic. Before, I would like to introduce the distinguished speakers which you've seen on the program. I would also, again, thank you for the excellent cooperation we had with the mission, but also with the staff. My name is Christian Egenhofer. I'm an Associate Research Fellow here at the Center for European Policy Study and a senior researcher at the Florence School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence. The theme, Australia-EU cooperation to address climate change in the Pacific, ideas for the way forward. You know that our slogan is thinking ahead for Europe, so we are taking this into consideration. When you look from a Brussels perspective, the Pacific is very far away. And when you look at the European map, you're certainly aware, you know, Europe in the middle, and then you go to the east and the Pacific, it stops with the Pacific, and you go to the west, the US, and it stops with the Pacific as well. So here we have a new sort of frontier opening, the Pacific in the European Union. But we talk about climate change, this affects us all. We all need to reduce emissions, we need to adapt, we should learn from each other, and ideally, I should say ideally, we also cooperate with each other. So these are a little bit the issues we would like to discuss. And we have three very distinguished speakers. I can promise you, I read their bios. They have a lot of experience internationally, something which is occasionally a little bit short in the Brussels discussion, so very happy to have you here. We have first Perpetua Latasi. She is currently, secretary in the Ministry of Home Affairs, and she has a very long career in government, including the Prime Minister on the environment, and she's also had a lot of experience in UN framework, among other being the chief negotiator for Tuvalu. So welcome. Maybe you take your seat here. I think we have foreseen this seat for you. Then we have Christine Tilley. Many of you know her from the international negotiations. She is Australia's climate change ambassador. Currently, since a little while, the face of Australian climate policy and focusing, we'll not be surprised, on the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Before, she had a lot of senior position in the Australian government, among other, and I was picking this up, she was heading the Office of Supply Chain Resilience. This is currently, as you have certainly experienced when going around, the #1 issue. So I'm sure you had some advice to our European colleagues on this. And beyond that, she was working for 2 decades on climate change and domestic environment policy. So I'm sure, I assure you know all these issues inside out. Then finally we have Diana Akoncia. She's Director for International Affairs and Climate Finance in DG Klima. Again, she has a very long background on international affairs, DG Trade. I don't want to mention all of this, but I picked up there is a very close relationship with the region we are talking. She was working on economic partnership agreements, and especially relations with East and Southeast Asia and Australia and New Zealand. So you're almost part of the family. Please, why don't you take... I think take this one. I should mention that at after the end of the meeting, there will be, you will have the opportunity to have a glass of Australian wine, so we can continue to discuss informally on these matters. Now, let us just now start with the discussion. The idea is, yeah, the microphones still don't work. Okay. So I would ask you to speak loud. The idea is that we have a conversation, but please, anytime, come in. If you have a question, comment. We want to make this as interactive as possible. Now, let me start with you, Perpetua. The Pacific is one of the most... Okay. No. Okay. Oh, I need to be careful. So, the Pacific is one of the most vulnerable regions, we imagine, yet at the same time quite resilient, if I understood in my preparation to this meeting. So, what makes the Pacific unique, and what lessons can we learn from your attempts on resilience?
Thank you, moderator, and a pleasure to be here. Greetings to you all here in this room from the tropical of Tuvalu. It's very cold here in Brussels, but I guess I'm resilient that I'm able to sit here with you all. Yes, so the Pacific, it's a series of small islands, and yes, so Australia and New Zealand are also in the Pacific region. But if we speak specifically on Pacific small island developing states, these are a group of islands which it includes islands that are low-lying atolls, so not mountains. It also includes islands that are still least developed countries, so that you can then realize the vulnerability of islands in this region. Coming to your question of resilience, I think over the years, and it also because of its isolation from the outside world, the limitation of access to resources that are outside of the region makes it as self-reliant, and that helps us build our resilience, because it is the only way for us to live and to continue livelihoods, because it is far from markets, it is far from access to trade routes, so it is the only solution for us to be adaptable to become self-reliant, in the sense that for us to build resilience while at the same time trying to sort the support that we need for the vulnerability, or to implement work that are needed to build resilience.
Thank you. Christine, from Australia, how do you see the Australian role, or the role of the Australian government in the Pacific to also support the resilience of that whole region?
Thanks very much, and thanks to SEPS and the Australian Mission here in Belgium, in Brussels, for organising this event. Look, I really do sort of want to emphasise a point that's already been made by Pepe, which is Australia is part of the Pacific. We're a large Pacific island. Of course, we have a very different geography and economic status than many of the vulnerable small island states, but we are very much part of the Pacific, both in terms of culture and people-to-people links, but certainly in terms of the political architecture. So the Pacific Island Forum, which is sort of the peak of the political architecture in the Pacific, and we're a full member of that body, along with New Zealand. But of course, we are different in many ways, and And sort of one of my examples is a European colleague many years ago had come to Australia for the first time and said, you know, she sort of left Sydney and sort of focused on some movies, ate a meal, read a book, and then, you know, sort of brought up the airline map, and she was 4 hours into the flight and still flying over Australia. And even for her from, actually I think she was from the UK, that was just such an odd experience. And I sort of reversed that, and I've had the good fortune to travel around the Pacific in my role, and you're just flying over vast tracts of blue ocean for hours and hours and hours, and then you see this little speck in the distance, and that's your destination. That's a Pacific Island nation. And so there is a real difference in the makeup of the Pacific, and in particular Australia. The way our government more recently has been approaching a broad swathe of how we engage in the Pacific Island Forum is very much guided by the mantra Pacific-led, Australian-backed. And so there are areas where, of course, we have more capability, technical assistance and financial support to bring to bear to some of the challenges in the region. But we are very, very, very clear that it's not us coming in and saying, here's what we'll pay for, here's what you need to do, here's how you should do it. It is listening to the Pacific priorities, understanding the challenges, and then working out where we're best placed to support the Pacific leadership on a particular issue, and climate is that in spades.
Thank you. You know, that's new to me. Australia is a large Pacific island. You know, our perception was a bit different. We always thought it's a continent, but you know, you always learn. Now, Diana, you had a lot of dealings in the past, and even more now with the Pacific, the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, OACP as we call it, and AOSIS as well, the Alliance of Small Island States. So what is the EU? What can the EU do, or what do you see is the EU role on this to cooperate in a general sense?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to share this discussion. It's actually very, very pertinent, and particularly in this moment, and I will say more on why in a moment. But about EU role and responsibility, you said correctly, we are not close by, indeed, so our relations is a little bit different, but on the other hand, it's true that via the what is now called the OACPS, it used to be the ACP, we have always had a very close relationship with the Pacific region, including on trade. I was involved in negotiations of the Economic Partnership Agreement with Papua New Guinea, and then extended to some other islands. I think Tuvalu doesn't have that yet, but and that was indeed an interesting experience, because you could see how something which is apparently small, like a concession on one product, that make a difference in a small island, because the scale is different. But on climate, I think the main challenge here is that the Pacific Islands are suffering the consequences of something that they have not caused, and that's something that we collectively, as developed the world and emerging world, more and more have caused, because you are not emitting, but you're suffering the consequences. So for me, the first and foremost responsibility of the EU towards ourselves and you is to reduce our emissions, and this is what we are doing. We have been the first continent to have a net zero target for 2050. We have an ambitious target for 2030 that we are on track to, and we are hopefully soon going to put into lower targets for 2040. And together with you, I think we led the way towards the Paris Agreement, for which the Pacific Islands were instrumental. I wasn't there, but you probably were. But so I know that was largely the result of a strong alliance. I think that also in Dubai there was a strong push on the global stocktake, where we were together. So we've always been on the same side. But today the European Union is only 6% of global emissions. G20 collectively is responsible for more than 80%, but the EU is 6%. and we hope that our percentage will go further down. So I think that at the moment the biggest responsibility that we have towards countries like Pacific Island is to collectively push worldwide the big emitters for a reduction of emissions. We will continue to do our homework and we will stay the course in the EU, but we have to continue to push the others. And here perhaps I have a request to make to Pacific friends, you have to continue to push as well. We need to push together because the likes, okay, the US now unfortunately is, maybe it's not reachable by pressure, but we need to continue to keep pressure on others like China first and foremost, but also if you see India now emits more than the EU, they are still in the position to say we didn't cause this mess, it was you, and you have to act first. But I think still countries that have growing emissions, they should also do something about it. So this is perhaps the strongest way that we can cooperate in this moment.
Yeah. Thank you. You mentioned we have been causing the problem, so so we have some responsibility. I will come to you as well on this one. I'm sure it plays a role. But Perpetua, if I may get back to you, what would you like to mean? Diana said we need to push together. That's good, but I think a little bit more concrete. Maybe you would like to have it. So, what would you expect realistically in terms of engagement by the EU, of course within the UNFCCC, but also more bilaterally? What would you expect? What could help your attempts on the resilience? But also, what would you be able to contribute to our discussion on the resilience? So, 2 questions, please.
Thank you. Yes, so the EU has been working with the Pacific for years. It has supported in various sectors, trade, not Tuvalu, but other big countries. But most importantly, looking at on climate change and then climate action. What can be done together with the EU, and I acknowledge the effort in reducing the emissions, because that is something that we need to start off with. It's reducing emissions so that we can also reduce the change in climate and temperature. So it is very important that we make the process or the systems work. The Paris Agreement have put in place or have asked countries or parties to develop their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions. And we have heard of the result of the global stocktake, which has outlined the direction that we are heading and where we're heading. So there are facts out there that we need to be used and bound by that in terms of our effort to address climate change. And I think that the EU can be at the forefront to set the examples and advocating and also influence some of the big developed countries as well as the emerging developing countries that are emitting more than some of the developed countries. So that is one side of things. But as we bring closer to the Pacific, what else it can be done to build resilience? And the list can be long. But what is important is that the countries in the Pacific are clear of what they need to do. We are also we have to develop our own NDCs, but those NDCs are conditional to the provision of financial support and technical support. And that is something that we are leaning towards, that if we also want to make a change and make efforts to address climate change, but there are limitations to our capacity. And this is where we look into our development partners to provide that support. It's not necessarily, I mean, we have this discussion just earlier before the session starts, it's not necessarily new money. but we need to be more programmatic, more strategizing of what resources that we have, of what technology, even the know-how. We might be able to get solar panels and batteries from somewhere close to us, like from Asia. But at times we do not have the know-how of how to operate and maintain those. And in London, of the events like this, I gave example that we ordered or we purchased solar panels and batteries all the way from the Netherlands and Finland, which is very, very far away from Tuvalu. So these are some of the broad aspects of how to reduce emissions and at the same time building resilience. So the cooperation is highly needed.
So if I understand correctly, you also make a plea for capacity building, and I would imagine we have a lot of experience in the EU about absorption capacity. There is so much money you can realistically absorb without having negative effects. So is that one of the elements you stressed to have exactly this, and maybe I'm sure the Commission and Australia knows about this?
Yeah, certainly capacity building is something that is needed. Like for any technology or for any efforts that we are to embark on, given its mitigation or adaptation measures, there's still a need to build a seawall in the Pacific to protect the coastline. You need engineers or coastal engineers, and these are some of the expertise that are not always available in a small island, and that is where capacity building comes in, and also the technical assistance from the experts outside of the Pacific.
Yeah, the engineers are not always available, but I'm sure the engineers are available on the large island. So capacity building, and so is the issue also from your discussions, is it also more about the capacity building, how to do this, or does the finances then play a lesser role in all of this?
It's all of the above. But to sort of build on the example we're just talking about a bit more, I mean, I think we do see limits, and sometimes you can't avoid it, but limits to, in our case, Australia coming in, bringing expertise, bringing funding, bringing the engineers doing the project and then leaving again. There can be so many good co-benefits from doing it with the partner government, training, and using local staff and bringing the skills to where they're needed. Not only because there's co-benefits from those skills then having a role, but you're actually building ownership and buy-in into the project being a success. Whereas if we're sort of coming in a bit more of a, we'll just drop this in and leave, nobody in the host country might be really interested in maintaining and making sure that asset works well. So I think there's sort of actually a lot of co-benefits in really doing it in a partnership model. But every project and every development partner will have slightly different needs and interests.
Christine, if I want to stay with you, what would you expect, and then Diana, I will come to you again. What would you expect, ideally, thinking it's Christmas, what would you expect the EU to do to engage with the Pacific together with you?
Keep turning up. I mean, I think in my own experience, I'd never been to the Pacific prior to my role, when I commenced my role 2.5 years ago, but I'd worked on climate for many years and thought I knew a lot about climate and what it meant globally. But it's not until you actually go and see and speak, and yes, it's at a political level because every leader, minister, member of parliament in the Pacific has a view and a strong view and lived experience on climate, but absolutely down at the community level as well. And so I think just, and I really do want to acknowledge that EU member states in recent years have shown a real interest in doing more in the Pacific and turning up, including at senior levels, but it's that sustained relationship building and demonstration of, commitment and enduring interest that I think is really important.
Thank you. Diana, you don't need to be indiscreet now, although we would appreciate. Now, is there, of course, I'm sure you've been so long around, you know AOSIS, you know all the situation, but can you muster really interest, outside the circles, outside the UN framework? Is there interest from this famous, Team Europe, if it ever emerges, and the Global Gateway, and you name it, can you actually get support and interest in this region?
Thank you. Well,
it's recorded.
okay, so forever. Look, we already, as we said before, there is a long-standing relationship. We support Pacific regional organization, technical institutions, universities. So I think on capacity building we are there. The EU also supports the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Assessment and Financing Initiatives, which is on the capacity to manage disaster risk. That I think is particularly important for the region. And we do have already a Team Europe initiative, which is called the Green Blue Alliance for the Pacific, with the EU, the member states, and the European Investment Bank. The EU contributes 200 million from our cooperation envelope, and the total estimated of the initiative is 540 million. This doesn't mean that we cannot and should not do more. In fact, what we would like to do this year is exactly step up our dialogue and to involve other actors. So what I referred to also before is that at COP29, my commissioner wanted to and wished to address the discontent that was left in some quarters on the decision on the NCQG at COP29. And so he proposed to the SEEDS and the LDC to start a dialogue at different levels, together with other partners. Some of the European Union member states are there, the Australia is involved, and the UK is involved. And we would like to have a series of events where we would like to go deeper in what the needs are, but also in how to make whatever financial contribution, whatever climate finance with the Pacific region and the SEEDS and NDC in general more effective. Let's be very frank, money is there, we were discussing before, capitals ready to invest in the energy transition are there, capital ready to invest in resilience is already a bit less, capitals that are going to vulnerable countries are even more scarce. And in the present geopolitical situation, where a lot of the climate finance has come to from ODA, and ODA is not going up, it's not growing. So we need to be more efficient, more targeted. We need to understand better where to put our funds, but also who are the partners that can help us. So what I would really like to do in this dialogue, and it's at a very initial stage, is to involve private sector banks and to understand how they can really step up their investment in these particular countries, how they can step up their investment on resilience, knowing that for every dollar invested in adaptation, the future returns are very high, but unfortunately they are not visible immediately. And I think this needs to change, because we know that we are going for huge losses on world GDP if we don't do something about climate change, if we don't do mitigation, if we don't do adaptation most of all. The European Union had its own climate risk assessment last year, and we were told that you are not prepared, the EU. So I can imagine that in other countries the situation is the same, and we need to do something about it, and we need to put our money where our mouth is. So I hope that this year, together with Australia and the other partners, we can really set something up that feeds into the process of the COP process, that gives some idea, for example, for the back to Belém roadmap, but even more importantly, that gets us some allies with whom we can continue to work later.
Thank you. I'm just looking around whether there are comments, questions, who want to break the ice. Here is one. No, I can. No, you do. Okay. Oh, you bring it back.
I have just a question to the ambassador. I would like, because Australia is very big, what is in your energy mix the percentage of coal nowadays?
Excellent question. I'll start with when our current government came in 2022, and renewables was 32% of our electricity grid. Coal was the vast majority of the rest. Gas is a small sliver, and there was a tiny bit of hydro. But so let's assume 32% renewables, so 68 others. Probably probably coal was 60%. And our government brought in a target of 82% renewables by 2030, and that is a real stretch. We absolutely acknowledge that. But our last quarterly, we do quarterly updates on our electricity mix. Our last quarterly report, which was October to December of 2024, 46% renewables, coal 48%. And our expectation, and our Climate and Energy Minister said just earlier this week, he expects this coming 12-month period that coal to represent less, like no longer the majority in our energy mix. That renewables in this current 12-month calendar year will be the majority of our grid. Now, still a long way to go, but for a country that has for many, many, many decades been built on very fossil fuel intensive energy mix and industrial base, I absolutely stand by the fact that there is real progress underway in our energy mix transition.
Thank you. Kirsten, we didn't plant this question, but I'm sure it's always coming wherever you are. And we had it last year with 2 years ago with the energy minister as well. Now there is one more question. If there is 2 or 3, we could get them together, so you have a good chance now. Otherwise, we take it from here. Can you identify yourself?
Hello, thank you everyone. My name is Aliyah Ahad, and I'm from the government of Bermuda here in Brussels. So I was very pleased to hear that the Commission will have some kind of dialogue that includes the UK, Australia and the EU. I wanted to ask whether there's any scope within that to include overseas territories like Bermuda, and there are of course other overseas territories in the Pacific, whether they're French like New Caledonia or also British like the Karen, etc. So just wondering whether you see any scope for overseas territories which often get excluded from this, even though we're also very much on the front lines of climate change. And then the second question was, when you're reaching out to private companies, the private sector, I wanted to also encourage you to think about insurance companies as opposed to only banks. And there's something really cool called the Insurance Development Forum that's looking specifically to improve resilience for vulnerable territories. And I think there might be a lot of synergies there.
Thank you. I think we're getting now deep into the Pacific discussions, which goes beyond my expertise. Yeah, please. I think this was addressed a bit to all of you.
I start?
Yeah.
Well, thank you. You've taken me by surprise with the overseas territories, and I shouldn't have been, because when I was doing trade with Pacific and with other parts, indeed the overseas territories were involved. We are doing it with France and the UK, so I guess that automatically includes also some of the overseas territories. But indeed, this is actually a good point that I will take home. On the insurance company, absolutely, they are part of the solution. I know that they are not. We cannot insure our way out of the trouble where we are. That's also very clear. There are some risks that cannot be insured, and I've heard several times partners from island states say when an event wipes out, I don't know, 5 or 10% of your GDP, then insurance is not enough. But they are certainly part of the solution. One of the initiatives that the EU is already supporting is the Global Shield that was launched by Germany a few years ago, and that's where exactly we are trying to increase the insurance coverage against disasters. So certainly they will be part of the conversation.
I'll just make a brief addition, and I can't speak, I'm not close to the planning for the event that Deanna referred to. I think from Australia's perspective we would have no issue with representation by all appropriate impacted vulnerable island states, no matter their political classification. But in the Pacific Island Forum, and Pepe, you'll correct me if I get this wrong, but it's not just UN member states in the Pacific Island Forum, it's Pacific countries and including some territories as well. So sort of the conversation is the same irrespective of the sort of political classification of your island.
You have? Okay. I don't see a question at the moment. There is one. Then we take this, and again, if there's a second one, we take them together. Otherwise, we just take this one. If you also could identify yourself.
Christian Lietz here, researcher from SAPES. My question is regarding the speech that we heard from Commissioner Sikela in the beginning of February, where he said that the EU can't do everything everywhere all at once, that we have to focus on our real strategic interests. The question that I have is what kind of signal sends that to small island states in terms of cooperation with the EU, because it also mentions in the speech that the competitive compass gives some indications on what our real strategic interests are. So what does this imply for, how is this perceived by small island states, and what does this mean for cooperation from the EU side also?
We are just very, very shortly in this new world now.
I can very well, I understand your question. I appreciate it actually, because I think it is something we do have to discuss. One of the answers I give you is that it is in the EU strategic interest to prevent climate catastrophe from happening, and it's also in the EU strategic interest to be close to allies that are together with us in supporting, among other things, the multilateral system. So I think that preventing some countries to go underwater, I think it continues to be a strategic interest. It is a different interest from, for example, supporting the competitiveness of the European industry. But I think that in the nature of the EU, there is to support multilateralism. I think since the US left the Paris Agreement, our president has been very clear that the Paris Agreement, that we are behind the Paris Agreement. She said in Davos, is still the best hope for humanity. So I think that there can be different interpretation of strategic interest, and it's not only supporting the competitiveness of our industry. And certainly the fact that we are investing time and resources in having a dialogue with the Pacific Islands, the other islands, the LDC, shows that we consider that the interest to work with these allies is still very strong for us. But I agree with you that this may require some explaining, and this is also one of the reasons why I'm actually happy to get this question, because I think this is also something we have to put on the table. But what I said in the beginning is, in this new world, aid money is not going to become more, and that's why I say we really need to be effective. We see what is happening on aid. Those of us that have worked in this field for many years are shocked. I think that we have to use this. I cannot say that we cannot use we should use children dying as an opportunity, but this is what we have on the table at the moment, and that's why we have to become more targeted and more effective.
Thank you, Diana, reminding us that despite this new focus, a lot of other policies still continue. There's a whole other agenda, even if we don't discuss it every day. You know, the rest of the world doesn't stop because of what's happening elsewhere in the world. We sometimes tend to forget. You wanted to say something, but also I wanted also to raise this question. You know, what is your take? You know, the agenda shifts. You know, and it's probably not in the favor of the small islands in the Pacific. How do you perceive this?
Yeah, it's a question that has been also asking in many other forums. How can we maintain the interest as a top priority to address climate change with other competing agendas? And for us in the Pacific, climate change is still the single greatest threat for us, and that is the agenda that we are investing in and seeking the cooperation of our development partners to be able to support resilience development. One of the areas that we seek or we see opportunities for more investment with the EU. It's because it's something that we have seen with our other development partners as well, and with the withdrawal of the support of the US from the Pacific, that has left a big gap of the cooperation, the assistance that we have received from the US to support facilitate access to climate finance. There are multilateral climate finance mechanisms that have already put in place that has also resources for small islands like Tuvalu and many others in the Pacific to have access to those climate finance, to do mitigation adaptation measures. But it is the step of getting those finance and I think that cooperation is really needed to help us. I hear Diana saying that the flow of new money is becoming difficult, but I think it's more on how to strategize and changing the architecture of climate finance and the decision making towards climate finance to ensure that what is out there, or what climate finance is available out there, is channeled towards the most vulnerable.
Kirsten, you've been, I assume, traveling around Europe, or you continue to travel around Europe, and you bring your story about the Pacific. So, you know, how does this new agenda, what do you hear when you go around, if you want to share some of the views there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't spend all my time in Europe. I usually only get here once a year. I try and spend a bit more time in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But look, I think absolutely, it's clear that sort of there is a real degree of just awareness that the world is changing quite rapidly right now in terms of the geopolitical context. And that there are multiple challenges that governments are facing at the one time. And one of the conversations I was in last week in the UK was around the recognition that leaders are, the word distracted was sort of used, but having multiple challenges to deal with at the one time. And what does that mean for climate ambition? And on face value, I absolutely agree that not having leaders leaning into driving stronger global ambition is a bit worrying in terms of on climate change. But at the same time, the climate negotiations, which are the crucible of global climate ambition, have become very political. And in some respects, I think there might be opportunity in sort of treating the global climate process, the negotiations, a little bit more as BAU and getting on with the job, rather than sort of insisting this is about building a whole lot of political pressure and, you know, taking people to the edge of will there be an outcome or not, because sometimes that doesn't work in favour of climate ambition. And so, you know, I think there is a little bit of silver lining that we need to try and hold on to in this current context.
Yeah, thank you. There was a question or a comment. I'll come in. So, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sarah Rinaldi. I'm head of unit for the Pacific in DG INPA. So, since there were questions about development cooperation and Commissioner Sikela and Global Gateway, I feel compelled to also intervene, although what Diana replied is perfectly in line and I can only support. But just to complement, indeed the EU has always been present as a development partner in the Pacific. We see ourselves as being part of the Pacific thanks to the French territories as well. More and more we want to synergize actually what we do in the territories, in the OCTs, in the Pacific and what we do in with the other countries in the region. And indeed, actually, when I'm quite new in this job. I started on the 1st of December, but I was working in the Asia Directorate, so listening to what was happening also in the Pacific. And I heard for a long time, I heard my colleagues saying, it's very difficult to implement Global Gateway in the Pacific because these are very small, remote islands. And when I arrived in December, actually, I saw a pipeline of quite meaningful Global Gateway projects, meaning infrastructure projects that aim at tackling challenges of remoteness, of isolation, of climate change, of course, climate resilient infrastructure, etc. So, and actually, I think Global Gateway applies to the Pacific, and this is where Pacific countries' interests and EU interests really match together. So there is no contradiction in what Commissioner Sikela said and what we do together with our partner countries in the Pacific.
Thank you, Diana. I'm sure you like to hear that.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
I didn't know she was here, so I have to pass it.
Okay, I don't see another question. Maybe we can continue the conversation. You talked about the dialogue and so Petra, the question is, what would you expect from the dialogue? But if there is a new dialogue, so obviously the old dialogue didn't take place, and we in the EU, we had a relationship, a formal relationship, ACP, and is also within the UNFCCC, the EOSIS relationship. So did we not discuss these issues, or what have we been discussing, if you wish? But let's maybe, Perpetua may have a first, and then you can think a little bit about what you have been discussing. So Perpetua, of course, Justin, that's for you as well. You've been also involved in that. Huh?
No, thank you, but I think I will hear more because we were just talking earlier about this dialogue that the EU is organizing, but I think it will be glad to hear more from Diana on what's being planned on the table, because there are, we have a long development cooperation with the EU through ACP, but it's also good to hear what is this being planned and what is, especially as we move towards the COP30.
Yeah, I have a bit overheard when you discussed, so there seems to be quite concrete ideas what you want to discuss.
Yeah, indeed. I don't expect that we make some shocking discovery in this dialogue, because indeed a lot of the discussion, for example, around access to climate finance has been there already. There have been years of discussion, for example, in the G20 on sustainable finance, on country platforms, on that. There has been the Bridge Down initiative that is also revolving around these kind of topics, and which kind of financial instruments you can design and how to reduce foreign exchange risk, and how to, there is the problem that, and the fiscal space and all that. So a lot of this has been on the table already for some time. I think what we would like to do in these conversations, which are really coming from, I think it was really a spontaneous idea of Commission and Hoogstraat at COP on we want to hear you more, or we need to listen more, but I think we have to be very practically oriented, as you say, and we have to try and find solutions that have been applied, best practices that we can replicate, to bring other actors around the table that maybe they're not always there. So again, the banks and the private sector, to come with success stories that we can show, and we can discuss how to reproduce them. But I think the thing that we have to do most is to listen. Before, with Minister Perpetua, I was talking about, she was telling me about the different funds, the GCF, the LDCF, the adaptation fund. What works, what doesn't work. And I think I learned something today, because I'm not involved in these funds. I learned that they couldn't access yet the adaptation fund. Why? What's the problem? Let's discuss it. So one part of the agenda could be devoted at how to make these funds work better. For example, we haven't done the agenda yet. We are going to have a first iteration of the conversation actually next week with some ambassadors here in Brussels, and then we're going to have other discussions during the year on the sides of different multilateral meetings. I think that we should listen to you. You should come with proposals as well, if possible, and we have to be a little bit creative. And I think starting from next week, we will really start discussing more in depth what we're going to put in this discussion.
Thank you. Very concrete. So if you want to comment on this, whoever.
No, thank you. I think overall it is a good initiative to start off and bringing closer that cooperation with the SIDS and LDCs. And I think there are a number of, like, if we talk about what are the priorities for SIDS and LDCs, I can speak both for SIDS and LDCs because Tuvalu is a SIDS and it's also an LDC. So I can tell you a number of things that or priorities that are needed to assist countries, SIDS and LDCs, to adapt well, and also to play their efforts in mitigating climate change. And one standout clearly is how to get better access to climate finance, because it is the finance that is that can help countries implement their adaptation efforts or adaptation measures on the ground, as well as doing mitigation efforts. So that funding is really important. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not always that we're asking for new money or for more money, but it's rather just to give us the opportunity to have access to those funds. The GCF, the JEF, the Adaptation Fund, these are the multilateral financial mechanisms that are out there. But it is a matter of how we can bring the capacity of SIDS and LDCs to be able to have access to those funds, because there are some of those funds we have equal access as other developing countries, and that is a challenge for us. And in addition to finance, I think it's also important to look into areas that can also assist SIDS and LDC, and this is particularly looking at building knowledge on early warning systems, and because it really helps in terms of adaptation planning. If we have good early warning systems in our region. And I think there are programs that are now and major support from also the UN Secretary General on doing early warning system for all, and several programs. But I think it needs to be understood that most of those models of early warning systems it's not applicable for a small island, and that needs to be also downscaled and more tailored to what is needed in small islands and LDCs.
Thank you. Kirsten, maybe if you allow me, you come a bit later. There was one more question. I'm also looking to the time. We need to gradually wrap up. So I would like to take this question, then I would have a sort of a conclusion, and you, not a concluding question, and then you also may, if you wish to comment to this, please feel free. So I come to you. Please be short and to the point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Calvin Nixon from the EU Institute for Security Studies. Now we were talking a lot about the role of the EU, the role of Australia in the Pacific, but of course there are also other actors which have stakes in the region. And interestingly, Tuvalu is still one of the few countries in the world which actually recognizes the Republic of China, Taiwan, instead of the People's Republic of China. So I would be interested, perhaps just in the dynamics. What does Taiwan bring to the table in the region? What does China bring to the table in the region? There were other countries in the Pacific over the past years which switched ties from Taiwan to China, so perhaps just elaborate a bit on that. And just a very short second question. Last year there was a Pacific Day in the European Parliament, I think. Are there perhaps any plans, if you know about it, that there might also be a second one?
Thank you. Next time we invite the parliamentarian, and then we would know. If I could just add on the final question, which is, where do you think, all three of you, where will be the more traction, the more bilateral or the multilateral for this Pacific? I'm sure you all will say both, but that's not what I want to hear. So where do you think is the more traction? The more the bilateral, what we're discussing here, or the multilateral? There was a question to you, so we start with you, and then Kirsten, there was maybe some other comments, and then, as always, we have the Commission having the last word. Please.
Thank you. A good question, touching on the geopolitics existing in the Pacific region. For us, Taiwan has been one of our good actors in supporting mainly on mitigation in terms of technology. That they have also now starting to invest in adaptation infrastructure. So it is a good partner, but it is still playing a very minimal role in the Pacific region because of the dominance of other countries in the Pacific that are now working with China. But it's something that because it's not a party to the UNFCCC, Taiwan, but it has worked through and becoming and has become our partner in delivering climate actions in the country. So and then overall on the question on multilateral and bilateral, and I think it can work both because because it is a global problem and it's something that we need to address it at the multilateral level. And at the same time as well, we also recognize the importance of cooperation, either multilateral or bilateral. But we know that if we are to go quicker or go faster, move faster, we can then do it on a bilateral level. But at the same time, I give recognition to the multilateral systems that are in place, the UN, for instance, the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, that has bring us together, and outcomes that have come out of this multilateralism is been in support of addressing climate change overall.
I'll answer two of the questions we've had. Just on sort of geostrategic competition in the Pacific, I mean, I'll answer it in a non-geostrategic way, which is, I mean, Australia's really proud to be the largest donor and the largest climate finance supplier in the region, in the Pacific, but we welcome other high quality, no strings attached contributions as well. And so I think there's not a question of who should be putting money in, it's how you put money in that I think we care about most. In terms of multilateralism versus smaller groupings, I mean, my answer as well is it takes both, but let me answer it this way. I mean, in terms of rapidly reducing emissions, and I know that's only half the equation, adaptation and resilience is vitally important, but in terms of rapidly reducing emissions to avoid the worst of climate change, it really is the G20, and that's kind of not necessarily the G20 forum, but those 20 countries and their actions really matter. But, you know, climate change is a stock and flow problem. Once, hopefully, we have peaked global emissions and they are on a downward trend, you know, if the G20 has taken the lead, hopefully, and is advancing sort of their own decarbonisation, actually then it's some of the smaller countries' emissions that are still contributing. And so, as they say, every tonne in the atmosphere has an impact. And so, until we're removing tonnes from the atmosphere, it remains a collective action problem.
So, complementing what the two previous speakers said, and I agree with everything they said, and I can bring a different angle, which is we are moving now under the Paris Agreement from a negotiation to an implementation phase. I think almost everything that should be negotiating left to be negotiated by the Paris Agreement is done. We have the NCQG, we have the Article 6 as well, that's been going on for many years. And at Belém, we will have also the closing of some other process like the global goal of adaptation. I think finally in Belém we will have the indicators. So now we are really moving on each country implementing domestically, and as Christine said, the G20 will be in the forefront, but everybody will have to do their part according to the principles of the Paris Agreement. And I think here the bilateral cooperation avenue becomes very important, because what we are doing as EU more and more is to establish bilateral or small group cooperation with a lot of countries and regions to help them implement the Paris Agreement domestically. One very important cooperation area for us is carbon pricing. Last year we established a task force for carbon pricing and carbon market diplomacy, which is basically a team within DG Clima, about 10 people that are going all around the world to support the countries that want either to establish domestic carbon pricing, either an ETS or carbon tax, but also countries that want to reap the benefits of the carbon markets, of global carbon markets under Article 6 or voluntary, but they want to do it with high integrity, because that has to be the underlying principle of the carbon markets. They are not the solution of all problems, but they can be one possible avenue to bring finance to developing countries and to countries who have natural resources. So the bilateral way, I think, becomes stronger when we have to go into domestic implementation, because we talk with each country to see what are the needs and what we can do based on the European Union expertise to help them. On the other hand, all of this has to come together, and each year COP will have to become more and more not the place where, as you said, you negotiate until the very last hour, but rather the place where we come together and say, okay guys, what have we done? What are we doing? Where are we and what we have to do more? And so it all comes together, I hope, beautifully at COP in the coming years.
Thank you very much. We are coming, I'm looking to the time, we're really coming to the end, and I'm aware that you will need to catch a plane. to continue your tour. So I would now like to thank the distinguished panelists and ask you not to clap yet, because the ambassador would like to close the meeting. So thank you very much for being with us. And now the last word is with you, and I'm trading my conclusions with you. Please.
Christian, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. My name is Angus Campbell. I'm the Australian ambassador to the Kingdom of Belgium, Luxembourg, the mission to the EU and to NATO. Quite a wide range and a wonderful team supporting me, and I'd like to acknowledge the great team here at CEPS and Christian's moderation of this evening's discussion. A really important discussion, because it's critical to remember always the climate does not care about you, and the climate is not waiting for you to decide. The climate is acting now. We have to choose together action that makes a difference. And engaging across the planet, from the blue continent of the Pacific through to the European Union, the world's largest and most successful common market, is critical to build awareness. Could I ask, if I might, a show of hands, who has travelled in the blue Pacific, to the small island nations? Only perhaps about 5% of our audience. I encourage you to do so, because when you can stand in someone else's shoes, you can come to understand the challenges that confront them. And all of us need to be able to extend our horizons and create that imagining of the circumstances that the community of our world is experiencing. So could I thank Christian as our moderator, Secretary Latasi from the Government of Tuvalu, Ambassador Tilly from Australia, and Director Aconcia from the European Commission. Thank you for a wonderful discussion, really engaging, illuminating, and indeed challenging, because that climate is not waiting for us. If you could join me in thanking our panel.
That's it, and there is drinks this way. Here. Yeah, okay, downstairs.